I wanted to start open with a little prayer. And here I'm adapting something from Wendell Berry. I know he's not Catholic, but his writings on the land, I think he should become Catholic, but some of his writings on the land I have found quite compelling. So I thought I sort of adapted something that he wrote that is in this secular book, but some of you might be interested. It's called Farming for the Long Haul: Resilience and the Lost Art of Agricultural Inventiveness. It's kind of has some interesting thoughts. Okay, so let's begin. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. And here I'm quoting Wendell Berry. Our future is not in the piecemeal technological solutions that our society now offers, but in a change of cultural and religious values that will encourage in the whole population the necessary respect, restraint, and care. Even more important, it is in the possibility of settled families and local communities in which the knowledge of proper means and methods, proper moderations and restraints can be handed down and so accumulate in place and stay alive. We pray in this spirit, Lord, for the values of respect, restraint, and care that you wish to cultivate within us through Christ in his life, death, and resurrection. May you bless each family here in the mystery of your Trinitarian life. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. Okay. Now, so Aaron kindly mentioned my book, which I'm sorry that I don't have copies here for all of you, but it can be pre-ordered if you go to the website. And the website, if you got a handout on the page, I'll be kind of drawing from that, and the website is there, and there's a QR code if you would like to look at that. Now, just to preface my comments, why did I even write this, and who am I writing for? I think working as both an engineer, and I've worked out in the field for a number of years. Now I'm doing more teaching and writing. But I did become kind of frustrated because technology alone is not succeeding in solving some of our food issues and ecological issues. I worked for a while in remediation of contaminated groundwater and soils, and the technologies were important, but I knew something more was needed. And then I think from my perspective as a Franciscan Sister of the Eucharist, and we are a religious community that works the land, and I felt very much at home today with all of your sessions and this beautiful Catholic Ecology Center. Just felt very much at home, and to see all your lay families doing it was very much in compliment to our sisters. So I had really resonated with the idea of care in Laudato Si. When I first read it, I was working with Salt and Light, and we were filming for the Creation series, and they had gotten an early copy of the encyclical and said, "Can you read this? We're going to interview you first thing in the morning." Well, at that point, it was like 7 p.m. at night, and I looked, and it was 200-something paragraphs. So I was up most of the night reading this. But one of the things that really caught me was the word care. So the subtitle of the encyclical is On Care for Our Common Home. And I was expecting to see stewardship everywhere. Later, I Googled it, and stewardship was used twice, and care was like 43 times. So that choice of care, and later I heard an interview with Cardinal Turkson where he commented on that, and he said that word was chosen very specifically because care means it's something coming from the heart, from within us. And, stewardship is a little bit more the steward of the estate. It's a little more sort of just taking care of managing the resources. And so that got me to thinking that as persons, as Catholics, we need to be working on this dynamic of care, where it's coming from the inside out. So, for example, when I work with my students, I will often start the course by asking them to just provide me with a brief essay on a place that they have loved in their lives. Could be anywhere, a lake, just their backyard. Describe it for me, why they loved it, and then tell me how they would feel if they went back now and the whole place was trashed. And what I'm trying to do with that, I've received some really beautiful reflections from the students. And what I'm trying to get at is for them to reflect on what do I love? And loving the land is part of who we are as humans. We love God, we love others, and we love the land, and to try to get them in touch with that. So I think that was another reason why I wrote the book, was to sort of unpack this idea of care and the sense of the interior growth that's needed for us to care sort of from the inside out. I also have a conviction that science and theology can work together well on this, and both have a lot to offer and could be a good model for today's culture. Now, who was I writing for? Well, for Catholics, and especially groups like yourself, I think people looking for an integrally Catholic view that kind of pulls together all that you care for and love. But within the structure of the 2,000-year Catholic tradition, I just don't think there's enough of that out there. Laudato Si is a gift, but now we have to really unpack it in the light of our Catholic faith. I was also writing for scientists and engineers, and so hoping that this might grab them if they have a faith dimension, that this might show them how to put the two things together and they're not separate compartments. And it sounds like a tall order, but I was writing also for non-Catholics who, I meet a lot of people in ecology, and they sort of say, well, I believe in God, but I kind of find my God in nature. And I was trying to write for that group too, to help them with, maybe this is a way that's palatable to you that could draw you in deeper into a faith dimension. So, but for you today, I'm really honored to be there. And I have to say, very impressed with, I went to the sourdough number 2 class, and it was just wonderful to see all the kids with their hands in the dough. And I think we might get some crackers or a loaf of bread later. That was the fruit of and then at the same time, my sisters were in Michigan, were texting me, they're working on our grapes. So they're all full of grape juice all over, and they're making grape juice, and we don't make wine, but they're making grape juice and grape jelly and grape jam. So it just was a wonderful convergence of all that. Okay, so what am I going to do in this lecture? It's kind of a survey, but I think it's good for us to situate our very personal, local activities in the big picture of the church. I mean, that's the joy of the Catholic Church. It is Catholic, and it is global, and it's universal. So we have just a lot going for us. So first, as Aaron mentioned, I would really like to show you, hopefully it will come through, why caring for the land is sort of a constitutive part of our faith and of the church's social doctrine. And especially it took a big leap with Laudato Si, but it's been there. And Pope Francis is careful in Laudato Si to make sure he's anchoring himself in the previous popes, right? So he doesn't say he's making up a whole new thing. So I'd like to show you that, and also to comment a little bit on what that means for us as human persons, because I think anthropology, and the particular anthropology that we are privileged to have as Catholics, can really help speak into some of these reasons for why we should care for the land. So I'll start out first with a bit of a survey of Catholic social teaching. How did we get to integral ecology? Because as I said, it's part of a progression. It didn't come out of nowhere. Then I'd like to look at particularly what was the leap with integral ecology. And here I'll take from parts of my book in terms of how I am defining integral ecology, the major elements of integral ecology. And then hopefully there will be time to just look at a few examples. And maybe in the Q&A, if you can think about this, because I found in writing the book, I was looking for lived examples of integral ecology, and I found many examples that could qualify sort of in the secular realm among people who are interested in living this kind of, but it was hard to find good, strong Catholic case studies. Now, maybe I should have known about you all, because I could have put you in the book. But if you have more of a sense of other people, other Catholics who are picking up this tradition, I think that's important. Okay, so now the social teaching, Catholic social teaching, and especially from Rerum Novarum, Pope Leo XIII in 1891. Now we have Pope Leo XIV, so he's definitely going to continue that trajectory that started with our Catholic social teaching. He'll probably, I think he's going to weigh in, my guess is much as he has told us, very much more on technology. And what we're talking about, caring for the land, is kind of an answer to the technocratic paradigm, I would argue. But okay, so our social teaching has always said with the human person is created in the image of God, so we have an inherent dignity. And as social teaching was articulated, it also specified that we have an orientation to the family that precedes the state. Okay, so personhood, family, faith exist prior to the state. In contrast, socialism deifies the state, and the person kind of exists for the state. But in Catholicism, we advocate for a robust personalism in which the state exists to serve the person. So, and we can see these tensions playing out even in our culture today. Now, Catholic social teaching, as I'm sure you all know, it rose in response to the Industrial Revolution in the 19th century. There was a big global switch from agrarian, handicraft kind of based economies to industrialized, machine-driven societies, innovations in steel, electricity, chemicals, many technological innovations. This then led to mass production in factories, migrations of many persons to the cities, so increased urbanization, and then also the widespread transformation of transportation and communication systems. And I was thinking about this as I was driving here yesterday because I got caught in terrible traffic around Chicago, and in my mind I was trying to make good use of my hour and a half sitting there moving about 2 inches. And I was thinking, you know, this transportation system is not working. And this is the fruit of the Industrial Revolution. Maybe we need to get rid of cars totally and go back to like punctuated rail lines or something where we can park in different places and ride the rail and then go, something like that. But anyway, that's neither here nor there, I guess. But it just, all of that what we're seeing now started with all of this technological transformation from the Industrial Revolution. Now, in Rerum Novarum, Pope Leo was responding to these rapid changes, global changes that were occurring because of technology and all the transformations in the culture. And he argued in particular in Rerum Novarum, that was 1891, for private land ownership, because he argued that the land, connecting with the land was necessary for workers to create abundance and to preserve the human dignity and their family life, because they were being pulled off the farms to go in and work in these factories. So the land really provided work versus the demeaning kind of factory work that many people were getting caught into. And it was very disconnecting of communities and families. It was also a protection against poverty, which there was a lot of in that time, and a building up of just the nature of the human person because we work with our hands and the whole value of work. So the encyclical on the value of work, Laborum Exercens, is certainly worth reviewing for any of you who, that came later, but it just talks about the beautiful value of work for humans. And so he spoke about what he called willing labor. And it's how we learn to love the very soil that yields in response to the labor of their hands. And I think it's just so beautiful to think of coming, of course I'm a soil person, but thinking of coming to love the very soil, that we can really love and care for that very soil. And then also, I think it was important in those early social documents that living close to the land connected us to tradition, to our past, to past generations, and where the new technology seemed to be kind of just starting everything new and there was no past. And we certainly experience some of that today. Then 40 years later, so 1931, we're between the world wars, Pope Pius XI now, quadragesimo anno, he has further thoughts about the social and economic orders. He's picking up on Leo XIII. And one important principle that he introduces is the principle of subsidiarity, that wherever possible, matters ought to be handled by the smallest, more local, least centralized, competent authority, rather than by a higher and more distant one. So nothing should be done by a larger, more complex organization like the state, which can be done as well by smaller and simpler organizations like small towns and families and such. So we need to keep things as simple and local as possible. That's subsidiarity. And I think you all are really trying to do that in the lifestyles that you've chosen. Then I can't not mention the Catholic distributist movement in the 1920s and 30s, G.K. Chesterton and Hilaire Belloc, which taught that property should be widely distributed and even businesses as local as possible and connected to families. They promoted small-scale land ownership and agriculture as an antidote to the societal ills that we were experiencing at that time that were created by industrialization and the rise of urban life. So what their idea was distributism argues for many widely distributed private owners of property and businesses rather than most of the ownership in a small percentage of society. And they believed that this type of lifestyle would restore the family and foster community and was truly a Catholic way to live. Now, Pope Pius XII then also on this, it's not an encyclical, but he delivered a speech to farmers in Rome in 1946. It was called On Rural Life. And if you'd ever like to read that, it's also a wonderful reference that many people never hear, but it's worth mentioning because it's a beautiful articulation of the value of rural life in terms of the contact with nature that it affords, its rootedness in family values and rural culture, what it teaches us about the soil and caring for it, and caring for our neighbors, stewarding our relationships with our neighbors, and how this contrasts with the flight to the city and large land monopolies and sort of the anonymity of urban life. So a beautiful sense of how human communities can flourish. Now, then the next I'd like to mention is Pope Paul VI, 1967. So 35 years after Quadragesimo Anno, Populorum Progressio. And here he introduces the notion of authentic development or integral human development. And that really has been key now for the decades until we heard integral ecology. So I think it can be traced, that integral ecology can be traced directly back to this integral human development in Paul VI. And here too, the human person, the anthropology is key. Because Paul VI defines integral human development as development which is not limited to economic growth, but which is well-rounded and promotes the good of every person and of the whole person. And he called it a new humanism, a full-bodied humanism. And here he's referring to Jacques Maritain. So if you've read any of his work, he was a good friend of Pope Paul VI, and he had been writing about integral humanism for decades out of concern over the rise of fascism, Nazism, and communism in Western Europe. And so Maritain was trying to articulate some principles to fight against those ideologies. And he really wanted to develop a society that was worthy of the person, he called it, and one that recognized the sort of transcendent dignity of the human person. So I think whenever we think about land, care, our social tradition in the Catholic Church, we have to remember the transcendent dignity of the human person. That's at the heart of what we're about, and I'll say more about that in just a minute. Then, by the time John Paul II wrote his encyclical Sollicitudo Res Socialis in 1987, he wrote that for the 20th anniversary of Populorum Progressio. So no, the popes are building on the popes that have come before them. This is very deliberate, and it's also the way that the Lord is working. You can trace the Holy Spirit if you read these documents, if we trust that the Spirit is working through the popes. And these are high levels, so encyclicals are the highest level of authority in the church. So in that one, John Paul II, who had named St. Francis of Assisi the patron saint of ecology in 1979, and I'm happy that there's two Franciscans here in this. So Father and myself, we're very proud to be Franciscans. And you're all Franciscan in spirit. So he had named St. Francis of Assisi the patron saint of ecology in 1979, and then in Sollicitudo Res Socialis in 1987, he really spoke about three key relationships: the relationship with self, with our neighbor, and with nature itself. Many people miss this, and so when we get to Laudato Si, where Pope Francis talks about our three fundamental relationships being love of God, love of neighbor, and love of the earth, it seems like a brand new thing, but we can trace it. Pope John Paul II was saying that back in 1987. It needed to be reiterated in the context of today's time. So we've all heard love your neighbor, love yourself, but part of our Catholic social tradition really is also love the earth. And we'll talk about how we do that, because we don't quite love the earth the way we love, our neighbor. But we have to care for the earth. Okay, so now one thing that John Paul II mentioned was that development actually has a moral character. So if you're a moral theologian, you should be thinking about development, right? Because that means it can be done in ways that foster the growth of human persons and communities. It can be done in ways that really hinder that growth and that actually hurt that growth. And then Pope John Paul II says, a true concept of development cannot ignore three considerations which alert consciences to the moral dimension of development. And a lot of what we need to be about as Catholics now, I would say, is alerting consciences, because we're kind of dulling our consciences, unfortunately. So the three things to alert our consciences: the use of the elements of nature, the renewability of resources. So in nature, everything is regenerating itself, but in the industrial system, it's more of a linear system, not a circular one. And the third thing, the consequences of haphazard industrialization. So industrialization by itself is not bad. It's when it's haphazard and it's not keyed into the proper way to use natural elements and to renew those resources. So he's laying out a lot of a framework here, and he did extend Paul VI's notion of a new humanism to include our human relationship with nature. So here we can see this another little increment, and that's key to framing our Christian anthropology. His 1990 World Day of Peace message was focused on the ecological crisis and its moral implications, and he spoke about preserving the integrity of creation along with respecting the life and dignity of the human person, that those should be the guiding norms for sound development. I was delighted when I went to the parking lot and there was a sticker on one of the vehicles, 40 Days for Life. And I thought, this is what we should be seeing at an ecological conference, at an ecological day, because we should be seeing protection of our natural ecology and protection of human life. And that's in our social tradition. And Pope John Paul II was especially concerned about what he called the destruction of the natural environment irrational, but then he said he's even more concerned about the more serious destruction of the human environment and the need to safeguard the moral conditions for an authentic human ecology and to honor the natural and moral structure with which we have been endowed. So that's his particular legacy for us. Then Benedict XVI, who was to earn the name of the Green Pope, he really extended then John Paul II and Paul VI, adding kind of his own distinctive stamp. So, and his, I think, distinctive stamp was to talk about natural and human ecology and the links between them. And then he associated that, he called, that's really the ecology of peace. If we can get our natural and human ecologies in harmony, we're going to have peace, which is a beautiful concept. He called the beautiful Canticle of the Creatures of St. Francis of Assisi an example of an ecology of peace. So we can look at that canticle for if we want to know more about how we live this sort of integral human and natural ecology. He didn't use the word integral ecology, but he had a whole chapter in his encyclical Caritas in Veritate, so love in truth, in which he dedicated the chapter called The Development of People, Rights, and Duties and the Environment. So chapter 4, an entire chapter, which at the time was groundbreaking. And he puts it all in the context of love in truth. So something about caring for the environment has to do with love, and it has to do with adhering to the truth. And again, that's consistent with John Paul II, the moral nature of this. He argues that only a humanism open to the absolute can guide us in the promotion and building of social and civic life. So I think one thing that Benedict added to the conversation is this real press to keep the transcendent element in the equation and in our social teachings. So it's about how we relate out there to the society, to the culture, to the earth, but it also has to have a sense of how we relate to God, the transcendent God. And he too emphasized that we have to have a proper sense of who the human person is. So he said, nature is a gift to us, and it is our vocation as humans to steward it carefully, not to dominate it according to our pleasure. At the same time, it is contrary to integral human development to view nature as more important than the human person. Okay, so he's a great thinker, a great theologian. He's nuancing our approach here. And he said, if society loses the concept of human ecology and the dignity of the human person, it will also lose the concept of natural ecology. And here I might argue he's going back to Gaudium et Spes, one of the Vatican II documents, where they talk about if we lose the person, we lose creation. And that's something key, I think, for us as Catholics. If we want to pick up one thing, is we lose human ecology, we lose natural ecology. And that, I think, is confused, unfortunately, in the secular culture ecological dialogue. Also, an important concept in Benedict XVI is the idea of the book of nature. And in my book, I take that up in greater detail. I won't talk so much about that today. But he says the book of nature contains a grammar. He's going back to an analogy that the patristic fathers used in the first century of the church. So an ancient tradition, but that nature contains a grammar within it that teaches us to respect both human and natural ecology. And this includes the environment. It also encompasses moral questions related to life, sexuality, marriage, the family, and social relations. So it's a comprehensive look, that he's a comprehensive stamp there. And so, as I said, Pope Francis then comes along and he builds on this continuity. And when the encyclical first came out, there were many people, going to all kinds of different authors that they felt that Pope Francis was drawing upon. But if you read the introductory chapter, he goes through the popes, and he also brings in the patriarch, the ecumenical patriarch. That's the continuity that he's drawing upon. And so I just went into a little more detail, but I'm following his lead, right? And so this idea of private property, the notion of subsidiarity, distributism, integral human development, the moral dimensions of development, respect of self, others, nature, natural and human ecology, St. Francis of Assisi, the book of nature, love and truth, all of that now is where we had been. And when Pope Francis then wrote Laudato Si, he's taking it one step further. And he's essentially walking in the steps of the tradition of integral human development, but now calling it integral ecology. And that's, I think, a beautiful tradition that we have. That's why I wanted to write the book about it, because I think we need to reflect more on what it actually is and what it's calling us to. Always at the center is the conviction that caring for the land is a constitutive part of our human identity, of who we are and of our human dignity. That's at the heart. And then the three fundamental relationships that he specifies in Laudato Si 66, with God, with others, and with the earth. And caring, I think the Catholic social tradition is then, how do we live out those relationships? And where we've sinned, it's against one of those relationships. I like to picture it that, and I teach my students this, but hopefully when we get to heaven, right, we're going to bring some gifts for the Lord. And if our three fundamental relationships are with God, with others, and with the earth, then those are the gifts we should bring to him. How have I loved you, God? How have I loved my neighbor, my family, my friends? And how have I loved the earth? And I give you some of my most beautiful tomatoes, or today I give you my most beautiful grapes. And I think it's just a good way, and then to review, even when we go to confession, then, how have I disrupted the relationship with God, my relationship with others, and my relationship with the earth? Those seem to me very good practical practices that are, you could say these are integral ecology liturgical practices, but to frame our lives together in relation to those three prime relationships. Now, I have a quote under each of these sections, because some of them, they weave through the book, but the first one is this dissonance that Pope Francis spoke of in his message for the World Day of Prayer for the Care of Creation in 2022. And he said, if we learn how to listen, we can hear in the voice of creation a kind of dissonance. On the one hand, we can hear a sweet song in praise of our beloved Creator. On the other, an anguished plea, lamenting our mistreatment of this, our common home. And just a penetrating quote, I think, and that was critical in the beginning part of the book, because what I was trying to do was, how do we resolve those dissonances? Because that's the tension in society now, is living with those dissonances. And I was trying to have the book be of service to that process. Okay, now, that's 1/3 of the way through. Sorry, we only have like 3 hours left. But, but don't worry, you'll have suffered and your pig roast will taste all the better. No, just kidding. Okay, now what is integral ecology? Can we say a little bit more about this? And here I take the quote from the Laudato Si that I really love, and that is really the core of the book. The external deserts in the world are growing because the internal deserts have become so vast. And that quote is actually Pope Francis quoting Pope Benedict. In his inaugural homily as Pope, he said that. Many people don't realize that. And Pope Francis then quoted him in Laudato Si, and then Pope Francis writes, for this reason, the ecological crisis is also a summons to profound interior conversion. And this is what Father was alluding to in his welcoming comments today. So the need for this interior conversion. One reason I emphasize the interior in the work that I've done, it seems like there's a lot of emphasis on cleanups and, restoring wetlands and all that. And I love all of that. But sometimes I would think, but we need to emphasize what is happening inside us with these, because it's not everything all out there. It has to do with the interior conversion. So I'll come back to that in a minute. Okay, now, integral ecology, what is it? It's kind of an abstruse term in a way, but it's a beautiful one. Integral means whole. So I'll first take, what does integral mean, and then what does ecology mean? And this is how I take it up in the book. I'm not saying I have the whole answer, but I thought this was at least one way of looking at it. Integral in terms of 4 elements, science and theology. So, and Pope Francis says this in the book. He said that people tend to forget the rich contribution which religions can make toward an integral ecology and the full development of humanity. So let's not be sort of apologetic about our faith. We have something to offer here. And I think Catholics have a great deal to offer, because we have 2,000 years that we can bring to bear on this. So this idea of the gospel of creation too. But you can bring science and theology together in this language, because technical solutions are powerless without the sense of faith. He says they'll be powerless to solve the serious problems of our world if humanity loses its compass. And our faith gives us the compass that then can help guide our technology and our science. So science and theology. And how am I doing on my, okay. Here, I came across a beautiful notion of transposition in C.S. Lewis, in which he talks about this idea of transposing. So if a richer system is to be represented in the poor at all, it can only be by giving each element in the poor system more than one meaning. Now, what does this mean? So think of transposing an orchestral piece, that's the richer system, into a piano version, the poorer system. The same piano notes have to represent multiple orchestral instruments, right? And so C.S. Lewis says, I'm going to extend that analogy to the spiritual ecosystem. He doesn't call it ecosystem, but that's the richer system, and the natural, which is the poorer system. So nature, this poorer system, is communicating multiple meanings, because it's the transcendent meanings have been transposed onto this natural system, and it's all part of a larger transcendent spiritual ecosystem but everything, and that's the same, our human bodies are speaking transcendent mysteries, but it's all been transposed from the mystery of the Lord. When I read that, I just thought that was so beautiful. He has an essay on transposition. It is beautiful. So to me, that's one way we can approach how we look at this integral ecology, this kind of holistic way, looking science, nature, then natural and human ecology. That's the other way that integral ecology can be viewed. It's always a social approach. We can't take ourselves out of the ecosystem. Then the third is that integral ecology encompasses not only exterior but also interior landscapes. And this is that external, internal deserts. And it's especially important, as I'll emphasize a little bit more in a moment. And I think, unfortunately, technology is pushing us out into exterior, superficial. And so we really need a discrete effort. And I feel like I'm speaking to the choir here because you're all trying to do this so much in the lifestyles you've chosen. And I can't tell you how happy and encouraging it is for me to see it. But to help our young people learn how to go interior. And then the fourth way of bringing this kind of integrality is these three prime relationships: God, neighbor, and the earth. And so I emphasize those in the book as part of this integral ecology. Then on the science side, the ecology side, if I can, are any of you in here science people? Oh, hey, we got one. Thank you. Well, there's a concept called ecological resilience that I think we can bring into this dialogue. It was introduced by a scientist named C.S. Holling in 1973. And it has to do, and resilience now, I'm amazed, because I've been studying this for years, and now resilience is in everything. It's in, it's in business theory, but I would say, well, actually, it started in economic theory. Schumpeter, I think, had it. And he talked about, in economics, one level of, say, technology dies out. And he used the example of, so a typewriter dies, we no longer use it, but then something else comes in its place, the computer, right? And he said that's what he called creative destruction. So, and he used that term in economic theory, that as one level dies, the other one comes forth. Well, C.S. Holling, in his work in ecology, extended the idea, because in ecology, we had always taught, okay, the way to get an ecosystem to stability is, if it's an open field, plant, and you want it to be a forest, plant some seedlings, small things, and then they'll grow and they'll get bigger, and then they'll become a forest. So there'll be an oak forest, and that's the end of our succession process, and that's it. But Holling said, actually, that's not how nature works, because we have hurricanes, we have fires, we have floods. And we've always treated those, and we did this in our management, so the Smokey the Bear, get rid of fires. But actually, Holling very effectively argued that nature actually needs those, and he called them creative destruction events. And that's what brings resilience into the system. Because after a fire, the fire actually opens up the seeds, because the seed coat is too hard for the seed to get out and sprout unless the fire burns it. And then those seeds will sprout after the fire. So he argued that we can't just stop at thinking that a fully developed ecosystem is the forest. It actually has to incorporate these, what he called the back loop, and that's that sort of cycle that I have on your handout, where you can see the gradual accumulation, but then some kind of a disturbance, which is pretty radical, that then shifts the whole system. And nowadays, actually, we know, because we have a lot more data than when Holling was working, ecosystems, this shocked me when I came across this data, but ecosystems as a general average are only about 40% efficient. Now, in engineering, we're trying to design for 95, 99% efficient, right? Ecosystems are only 40%, and that's many, many ecosystems organized, and there's very little fluctuation around them. Why are they so inefficient? Because their inefficiency is balanced by their resilience. Because they have this resilience built in, So they don't need to be 90% efficient. They have a certain level of efficiency. Then when a disturbance comes in, they have the resilience to bounce back. And that, I think, there's many beautiful human analogies we can learn from those natural analogies, and that's been great food, even for my own personal spiritual growth. And so I think that's an important concept, and that was the primary one that I worked with on the ecology side, because I think it's also important ecologically that we design for resilience, not efficiency, right? And now we know we shouldn't stop fires, because then what happens is we get these huge conflagrations. So now the U.S. Forest Service is backing away from Smokey the Bear, right? Because that wasn't a wise approach. So, okay, so does that make sense? Okay, so those are sort of the integral and the ecology part of the book. And then just to emphasize this notion of anthropology, the centrality that our understanding of ourselves is well situated. Now, I'm not trying to argue that technology is bad and causes a misunderstanding of who we are. It's actually, techne means art, skill, craft, all the things you were doing this afternoon, that's all techne. Sourdough, that's all techne. It's good. It's a way of making or doing. I think the word actually comes from the word to weave. Tex comes from the word to weave, which then developed into fabricate. And technology, logos, so a speaking, a telling of the word. So technology itself is good, but the technocratic paradigm is a distortion. And that's what we're really struggling with culturally today. Distorted by power motives, a sense of boundarylessness, there's no limits. And once we start living as if there's no limits, it has many implications in family life, in cultural life, in technology. It kind of overly emphasizes logical and rational procedures and gaining control over things, which really, that sense of needing to control and be powerful over things goes back to Genesis, right? The sense of the dominator. And that's really not who we're meant to be as humans. And I think another thing that technology is unfortunately leading us into, which maybe those of you who are younger, I think could identify with maybe more than those of us who are older, but we're losing the sense of the real. And there have been a number of things that I've read recently about young people hurting themselves in various ways and not realizing this was really going to do something. This was really, or using a gun and not realizing this was really going to kill somebody. So I think that the real then becomes what's electronic, and we're just all confused as to what reality is. That also isn't a part. We have to represent, and as Catholics, as Eucharistic Catholics, we have to have a very strong sense of what the real is. So, okay, so a few points now before I get into the case studies. Who are we not? And then who we are, because sometimes we can figure out who we are better from who we're not. So we're not, as I said before, we're not just one being among other living beings. Every being in ecology has a special niche. And so I've been using that concept as I've been teaching about this. The humans have a special niche too. And it's not the same as your dog or your cow. It's a very unique niche. And we're not meant to exercise domination over creatures. We have to eat, we have to live, so we are meant to use this created world, but not to dominate it in a sense of power and limitlessness. We're not meant to be alone, so our social teaching teaches us that. We're social creatures. We're not meant to be reduced to object. We're personal. We're beings, so we don't want to reduce one another to an object. And finally, we're not God. Okay, so we have to remember that. Can be, in today's world, we can really very subtly start to think that we're God. Try being a professor, and you learn all this stuff, and then it's like, well, am I thinking I'm God right now? I better cool it, So it's a good self-examination, okay? But then who are we? And here I go to Laudato Si, but it's drawing directly from Genesis, really. We're meant to contemplate creation, and I love the term serene attentiveness that Pope Francis uses in Laudato Si, that we're to contemplate creation with serene attentiveness, which means we have to notice it first of all, And I love all the things you have on the land here that help people know what kind of species they are and where they're going and all that, just beautifully signed and all that. We're also meant to both till and keep the garden of the world. So we have to till, we have to eat, but we also need to keep. So that means we need to preserve. So we need to keep that in balance. I think we've had a great imbalance, tilling. And then we have ecocentric people on the other side, keeping. Somewhere we got to be mediating in between the two. And then finally, we're meant to lead all creatures back to the Creator. So this is when we get to God, we need to be able to say to God, look what I brought you. I love lakes, and I'm giving you this place on this lake that I restored, that I love, that I lived my family with, and I want to offer it to you as I come to you. We can't give him everything, but where we have personally identified, we give it to him. So we're to be cooperatives with God, and in these ways of tilling and keeping, contemplating, and bringing things back. And that's a role with great responsibility. And so if we withdraw from it, we're withdrawing from our responsibility there. Okay, so I have 3 images, but here I just want to emphasize the one, but one is Homo sapiens, that means the wise man, right? So we should be wise men, and sapiens actually means to contemplate, so we need to pray for the gift of wisdom. We are makers, Homo faber, so we're supposed to till, to lead all creatures back to their Creator. We can't run away from that. We are meant to be makers. That's part of our identity. That's what we naturally do as humans, whether it's making sourdough bread or fixing lights, or we're meant to be makers. But there's a beautiful book by Gerald Van, a Dominican priest, called The Heart of Man. And he says, we are meant to be makers, but we have to be lovers first. And that's a beautiful way to situate. So lovers first, then makers. So our actions, our doing should flow from that from our heart, from what's within us. And we know people when they're living from their heart. We know, we can tell. And that's who we want to be as Catholics. And I think Pope Francis in Dilexit knows. He has a beautiful section on returning to the heart. And I think that's the inner. We have to return to the heart. This place where every person of every class and condition creates a synthesis, where they encounter the radical source of their strengths, convictions, passions, and decisions. Yet instead, we find ourselves, he says, immersed in societies of serial consumers who live from day to day. So we have to continue this movement within, living from the heart. So the wise man, the maker, but the big one I really love is the gardener, Homo agricola. So to till and keep, and through that to lead all creatures back to their Creator. That's, I think, a beautiful image of who we are. So we're not the same as the tomato plant or the rabbit that goes in there and eats your tomatoes. We're the one that is gardening that garden, right? And you don't want your garden to be contaminated. If there's a bug that gets in there, you want to be out there picking that bug and getting rid of it, right? And if you don't know what it is, you're trying to figure it out. So we go back to Genesis. We're called to till and keep the garden of the world. And we're called to that sort of enclosure of the garden. The Old English root of the word means enclosure or courtyard. So I think to recapture that, when we're gardening, we're returning to that sort of inner enclosure where we are communicating with God through our work with creation. And we do so by having serene attentiveness and knowing our science and all of the techniques we need to do that well, and getting our families involved. And I think when we garden in this sense, we actually ennoble the creation. When I was walking around your gardens today, it was just stunning. We're ennobling this natural world, and we're also ennobling who we are in the process. And we ennoble, it's sort of a mutual ennobling of our 3' relationships, because it makes God happy too. And we're speaking his language. We're learning the language that he has imprinted on this creation. And so I think when we garden well, we're living our call into integral ecology. Now, in my last few minutes here, I'd like to just introduce a Franciscan component of integral ecology also as a pilgrimage into these relationships with God, others, and the created world. As a Franciscan, I love St. Bonaventure, and he wrote a wonderful treatise, spiritual treatise called the Itinerarium, or the Journey of the Soul to God. And basically, he has three major stops on the journey: the out, in, and up. So we first, because we're embodied creatures, we relate to the world out there. But we don't stop there. Our dogs stop there. They might have a little inner, like if they feel like they're not loved or something, they might. But, if you have animals, but it's not like the human. So we have to work out there, but then we bring it within ourselves. And we process that, and we make it a part of our heart. We make it a part of our virtue. We make it a part of our uprightness, this way that we can deal with our relationships in an upright manner. And then we have to raise it all to God. So this out, in, up. And I think that's a good model for us to envision integral ecology as Catholics. We'd be very serious, and Bonaventure goes into great detail about how we relate out here, using our senses and how we bring them in and process. It's a whole theory that he puts out there in terms of how we process what's out there in the world and come to understand it. And then when we move within, he talks about not our modern science, but the sort of natural philosophy of the time. Now I think we could put our own science. That's part of the movement within. But then when grace enters in, if we believe in a sacramental life, that grace then can also penetrate our inner being, right? So that becomes part of that movement within. And that is critical. And then that drives us then in contemplation, in loving the Lord, to raise it all up to him. And I was thinking about that. Sometimes I find the upstage, it just feels like a little bit too beyond, where we spend so much of our life living out and then in and praying and everything. But on my way over here today, I stopped at the Basilica on Holy Hill, and there was a sign there. Some people told me, well, you can go up, and so I saw the sign, it said 178 steps. I thought, okay, I'm doing it. So I went up 178 steps, and it was tiring. And I got to the top, and then I was like, maybe I understand Bonaventure's up phase a little bit now. But what came to mind was, wow, you don't just get risen up like the angels on the up phase. You got to walk 178 steps to get there. And that's what you're all doing too, right? I mean, we're walking those 178 steps to get to that transcendent phase where we are with God. And that too, I think, is an important part of how we envision integral ecology, this holistic look at how we care for God, others, and the earth. We have to walk. So it does involve suffering. And that, I think, is also a critical, and if you want to make the analogies then with the creative destruction sequence, that it's such a beautiful thing that in nature we have death all the time. Otherwise, we would be drowning in our wastes. But no, creative destruction is a death that then gives life. I mean, that's what we deal with every winter, right? Things die back. Our systems, as we like to design them as engineers and as economists, is just constant growth. That isn't going to work, right? So somehow we need to, and maybe we can have some talk about this if we have a few minutes. How do we incorporate this kind of death to life cycle that's so dear to us in our faith? That's who Christ was, right? That's what he teaches us. And it's all around us, written in the book of nature. Death to life, that's just how it works. And everything, the other thing is it's written there is that everything is eaten by everything else. We humans are the only ones that kind of can get exempted from that. So it's all pre-Eucharistic. So we've got, if we want, I'm really going to the edges here, but we've got death to life, we've got pre-Eucharistic. Nature is teaching all of us that if we work with nature, we're taking that within ourselves, and maybe that would inspire us then with how do we live comfortably well, and maybe it's not going to be comfortable, suffering isn't comfortable, but how do we live in a dedicated, sort of committed way to that pre-Eucharistic, that death to life that is written everywhere in the book of creation and is core to our faith and core to Jesus Christ, who is at the heart of our faith, who we love. So I think the pilgrimage of integral ecology, as I would see it for us as Catholics, is that kind of comprehensiveness, that kind of journey out and up that brings us more deeply into the Eucharistic mystery and this mystery of death, death, and resurrection. And so I think I would just stop there, and if you have comments about maybe some people who are trying to do this, we can do that in the Q&A. So, did I leave any time for Q&A? Sorry. Thank you.
So we do have 5 or 6 minutes for questions. So if you can, there's not a second microphone, so if you can just stand up and project so we can all hear your question.
Don't be shy. Yeah, Peter. Great.
So when you talk about the efficiency of the system, what exactly do you mean by efficiency, I guess? I can prompt more with that, but if you...
Sure.
Could you describe the efficiency of the...
Yeah, so how these researchers did it. This was a major study. They measured, so ecologically, we measure energy transactions, right? So they measured energy, sort of energy in, energy out kind of thing. So energy coming in from the sun, how much of it is used by the plants, how much of it goes down into the soil, how much of it is used by the animal that eats the plant. And they did this, my understanding, if I recall the whole article, they went to ecosystems all over the world. I believe it was aquatic as well as land ecosystems. And they measured this comprehensively, and then they did that average. And they were shocked when they found out that it would really kind of clustered around 40%. Some were less than that. Some were a little bit more, but it wasn't a huge range. It was kind of amazing, converging around this less than 50%. So, but measured from energy, which is how we measure, that's how we measure in science and ecology. So, if that helps. Yes.
How would you speak to or convince someone who's either an atheist or not an atheist, but they believe in God, but they believe God is just energy, or like God is everything? How would you convince them that humans are different than animals?
Yeah, and I've actually, I speak to many groups, and not all are Catholic. So, in fact, tomorrow night I have a group of Lutherans that are even sort of on the quotes liberal end of Lutheranism. So I'm probably going to get these kinds of questions. I think, well, first of all, we start with common ground, and this would be, and this is something as Catholics that we can be so good at, because we share a lot of common ground with many faiths. Now we are going to, we somehow get pinned as we're like this rigid faith with all these rules, but I think to back off from that and try to find the common ground. So first of all, the fact that creation, I mean, we love creation, right? And I do try to make the argument, I'm not saying this is invincible either, and I would love if other people want to suggest ways to come into this, but I like to call it creation, not just nature, because even the word creation is disappearing from our vocabulary. It's used much less than it used to be. Because creation implies that there's something that created this, right? Now, an atheist is going to tell me, but it all happened, it's all evolution, and it's all chance that's doing it. I think you can make a strong argument, unless you believe in multiple universes, which I've also heard that argument, the possibility, and there's a wonderful book by Stephen Barr, he's a physicist, in which he takes up this argument. It's called Modern Physics and Ancient Faith. He's a great Catholic physicist. he does the probabilities of all of this forming and it's unbelievably small, right? Now, it's still hard to convince people who don't believe in God, but I like trying to put out that argument, and you can search the statistics. For things to come together in an order the way they have come together, for as long as they have come together without falling apart, is extremely unlikely. If it was pure just electrons interacting and energy exchanges and things. So I think we have to emphasize at least the probabilities there. And then I try to appeal also to the heart of the person that, you know, we're not just mechanical beings or robots. Why do we love? Why do we feel something beyond what we can physically touch? Somehow we're in touch with something that's beyond ourselves. We might not want to call it God, but we have a drive for that. And it's not something that can be defined simply by matter, interactions in matter. It's something that goes beyond that. At one point, I think it was in Houston, and there was a young man there who had presented a totally atheistic view in a biology seminar. He was an invited speaker, and one of the students got up, and he was speaking on neuroscience, so a lot about the brain and everything, because he was an expert on the brain, and he was claiming that everything could be found just in the matter of the brain. They just hadn't had enough time to figure it all out. One of the students got up and said, excuse me, professor, but do you love your wife? And he said, yes. And he said, well, how do you explain that in terms of neuroscience? And he didn't have an answer. And I thought it was a beautiful question, you know, bring us back to love, or why is there truth? Why are things true? It doesn't have to be. If it was all haphazard, maybe it could be true sometimes and not true other times. Why is science based upon a belief that there's truth? Right? So love and truth, those are the two biggies at Benedict XVI. So, and we have to be not afraid to engage in these conversations. I like to work with people on the land, maybe who don't have a faith, because I think it unlocks something in them, because they're touching patterns that transcend us, really, whether they want to acknowledge that intellectually or not. So anyway, thank you for the question. Maybe one, I don't know, do we have time for one more? Okay.
I don't really know how to ask this as a question, but I struggle right at the beginning of like industrialization and like the anonymity of urban life. And I live in a very urban area, and I'm just wondering what ecology has to offer for dealing with the fact that here we are in an industrial society, and I live like in the inner city. In any of your readings, what's the response?
Yeah, so excellent question, and I don't think we need to get rid of all cities. I actually was thinking, though, again, when I was in the traffic, maybe there's a certain size of city beyond which we should not go, and I think Chicago is beyond that. But within, like I lived in Houston, I loved it, but we were within the loop, kind of. You can have very personal relationships in a city, and I think we need to encourage those. So neighborhoods, ways of, unfortunately, in many cities, like the poorer neighborhoods are isolated from things like grocery stores. They can't get clothing, they can't get food. So somehow we have to design our cities better, and there are many working on this. The architecture department at Notre Dame is doing some great work in these areas. But to enhance human interactions in cities and physically make resources available in smaller communities so people can get what they need. Detroit, though I had in Detroit is doing what they call this agri-hoods. And I love what because Detroit was, you know, all the riots in the 60s, 70s and all that. But they've, with this Michigan Urban Farming Initiative, they've done these agri-hoods in the north end of the city. And they grow things, listen to this, because food insecurity is the biggest issues for the the poorer communities there. They grow lots of hot peppers and collard greens because that's what Detroit North Enders are like. But then one of their goals is to create hot sauces from their fresh peppers to sell. So they're starting whole like local economies, and we can do that very well in cities. We could also, if we didn't have such large cities, we could have city neighborhoods interacting with people who are growing food, maybe in a next ring out, and have that, because farmers need people to buy their food. And so I think we could do those kinds of things. And I would love it if we could start to see this in the future of how we, as an example of integral ecology, because we have more and more people living in the cities, but how do we do it in a way that's humane? In Houston, we started something on the campus where we took an old lot that the campus wasn't using, and we built raised beds, and I did it with my students. It was part of their class. And then there are a lot of refugees, and we had some African refugees that they know how to garden because that's what they came from. So we had them come, and we started all these little plots around the city, and then they set these African refugees to grow their produce and sell it. They started a cooperative, and they sell it, and it's been extremely successful. And so the refugee who worked on our plot at the University of St. Thomas in Houston, where I was, he now has enough money, he just bought a house, and his children are going to college in the States. So those kinds of initiatives too, that was a cooperative. We worked with a lot of people around the city to get that going. So those are just some creative ideas. It's called Planted Forward Gardens.